Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey. And as always, if you are just listening to this as a podcast and not on YouTube, my background image plays a little bit into what we're going to be talking about today. It is a foresty hillside in California, known for forest fires more than any other place in the United States. We are here with a retired fire captain, so I felt it was appropriate. I was just gonna have my background be fire, but I feel like that might be a little triggering, a little disrespectful. So I kept it with just the California hills. It also looks more pleasant for all y'all watching on YouTube or whatever social media you're at. So, like I said, we are here with a retired fire captain, but not just any ordinary retired fire captain. This is a man whose retirement was, as it often seems the case, not as expected back in my grandfather's time. And even when he retired, it was not the same as back when you would get a vacation or a fancy watch or some kind of nice work package. Nowadays, what you end up getting is thank you or a goodbye or you're forced to retire right before you hit that sweet spot, or in some cases, you get a terrible medical injury, as we're going to discuss today. And not only is our guest a retired fire captain, but he's also a transformational speaker and a life coach, Mr. Rick Cheatham. I am so honored to have a firefighter on the show. It's not often that I get first responders in law enforcement, mostly military. So to have the civilian equivalent in terms of y'all deal with it. The one episode I had, the deaths, the PTSD, the hardships, it really is eye-opening. A lot of civilians don't realize what firefighters and EMTs go through just as much as police officers and military members. So I'm
Mhm.
excited for you to elaborate on that and really show us what it's like. So, Mr. Cheatham, would you please introduce yourself for us?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being on your show. I think you nailed it. You said it all. I mean, I'm a retired fire captain with the city of Anaheim. I retired in 2020 as a result of the COVID pandemic that hit the country. My department gave us an opportunity to retire early if we chose, and I took an early retirement. So I got out in about a year before I anticipated. And when I got out, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and started off my retirement here. Loving it ever since.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start way back when you first, had the thought, I'm going to be a firefighter. If it was your thought, maybe it was
Mhm.
someone else's. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I'm going to date myself here, but back in the 70s, there was a show that came out on syndication called Emergency, and it was actually filmed in the county that I lived in. In fact, the one of the firehouses that they used was, not far from my house at all. And anyway, they opened my eyes to what the fire service was.
Mm.
And it excited me as a young boy. So here I am about 10 years old or something, and seeing Ronnie and, Johnny and all the different players on the cast. And I sorry, not Ryan, it was Roy. Roy and Johnny were the two names of the paramedics. And it just lit a fire under me and got me excited. And as life would have it, I ended up taking some course turns that probably would have eliminated my career to becoming a firefighter,
Mm.
and made some decisions that I had to regroup from. And so from my early 20s until my early 30s, I was in more of a reconstruction phase of my life, and cycling out of some of the decisions that I had made early on
Right.
that got me into some trouble. And by the time I turned 34, with 6 years under my belt of trying to become a fireman, I was finally hired with the city of Anaheim. It took me 6 years to finally get the acceptance letter. Ended up having to read 27 rejection letters saying, thank you for your participation in the process,
Wow.
but unfortunately, we're unable to hire you at this time. And I finally got that one letter that said, congratulations, you've been hired. We're going to give you a conditional offer. And that was around the summertime of 1996 is when that was. And I started my career in November of 96 with the Anaheim Fire Department and had a wonderful 24 years, loving every minute of it.
Yeah, so for those of us who aren't familiar with the process, there's a difference between paid firefighting and volunteer. So when you talk about those 6 years of trying to get hired, were those 6 years, were you on a volunteer team firefighting, or what was that fireman training you were getting under your belt
It
a
was
part of?
6 years. It was 6 years primarily getting the education I needed. So I had
Okay.
to go back to school and get my education in fire technology. Had to go through
Okay.
a fire academy. I did do a lot of volunteer work. So I volunteered for a few companies. Riverside County was my first volunteer in '89. I started working with them, which is now CAL FIRE. I volunteered with as an auxiliary with South Pasadena Fire for a year. I volunteered with Anaheim Fire for a year before they finally hired me. So yeah, there was a lot of that going on in that 6 year period. So you're not only getting your education, but you're also putting in volunteer work. And then with the
Right.
volunteer work comes putting in applications. And with the applications, there's a whole process that went on back then. It started with the physical agility. Once you met the academic side of it, there was a physical side of it. So you had to do a physical agility test and pass that. Then after the physical agility, you had to do an oral interview. Once that interview was, or actually you had to take a written test.
Mm.
Then if you passed that, you went on to an oral interview, and that oral interview was usually three separate interviews. So you started with just a regular interview, then it went to a chief's interview, and then it went to the actual hiring chief interview. So that you go through all those as well.
Wow.
And I made it all the way to the chief's oral on probably, I'd say, a dozen or so of the applications that I turned in of those 27, but always fell short just a bit on that hiring side. But Anaheim picked me up in '96, and the rest is history.
Wow. I think a lot of people have this misconception that you just show up saying, I want to be a firefighter, you throw on some gear and, get to it. So to know that there's such a
Yeah.
in-depth process behind all of
Well,
that.
it's a lot like the military. I mean, when you sign up to join the military, you got to go through training, and you
Yeah.
don't go through just your basic training, but you got to go through your AIT, your advanced individual training. So the fire service as a militaristic organization has a lot of the same structures, a lot of the same procedures as far as, you're looking at combat in one sense of being warfare. We have combat in our sense, so we're fighting fire.
Yeah.
So it's still a combat mentality, and we go through all the tactics and the strategies that you would go through in a military engagement.
Yeah, and y'all have casualties, trying to
Yeah.
minimize the
Right.
loss of life and
Right.
everything. Yeah, so it's
Right.
a real battle.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to kind of pivot to, I know it's a little off branch from that. The one EMT I had on the show, and I'll have the link to that episode in the description below. He talked about when he was serving on the fire department team that when 9/11 happened, that the whole firefighting industry and EMT industry felt it. It kind of rippled because they were
Mhm.
out there watching people who do what they do,
Yeah.
respond to 9/11. So I'm just curious how you kind of felt when that happened and if your department kind of felt it. If he said if you kind of notice a change in the culture and anything like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's right on. I was actually on duty the day that the towers were hit. In fact, I got an early morning call and responded to that call. And while we were leaving, our rookie was already up, made a pot of coffee, and we were bolting out the door on the call. And he was yelling at us as we're going by, man, the Twin Towers were hit. The Twin Towers were hit. There's a plane crash. And we're like, what the heck? And we're like,
Yeah.
okay, well, we'll figure this out when we get back. Let's run the call. So we came back from the call, and the second tower had already been hit by the time we got back. And yeah, it changed the fire service because in our minds we were under fire. We were the front lines to an active combat zone. And that's how we looked at it. I mean, we
Yeah.
didn't know all the preliminaries at the time. We didn't know exactly who, what, when, where, why, how, and all that. We just had our ideas. We had a sense of what was going on. And as the time developed, as more information came in, it became very noticeable that our profession was going to be forever changed. And I was on at the time trying to get on our urban search and rescue team, is what we had at the time. And although we weren't quite in the program yet, we were, I mean, I shouldn't say we were in the program, but we were on the farther end of the deployment schedule. So we weren't having to get deployed right away.
Right.
Our deployment came when they when they changed it from a recovery or a rescue to a recovery scenario, and we didn't have to go. So because there was no more recovery and they'd already pretty much determined that
Yeah.
most everything was going to be nothing more than a recovery effort instead of a rescue, we didn't have to go. In fact, they took one of our task force, which was up north in Oakland. They took them over us because they were new into the system and they wanted to get them in our program. And that was all through FEMA. And so we didn't have to respond, but I can remember vividly just sitting there and thinking to myself, 343 of my brothers died that day doing what I do every day, responding to emergencies. Catastrophe on a high steroid for sure with the Twin
Yeah.
Towers. But nonetheless, I could see myself in that instant, knowing that I would have been in that staircase, knowing that I would have been climbing, 90 to 100 and plus stories of flights of stairs, and trying to pinpoint and get to the seat of where that fire was and see if we can make a difference. We know now, hindsight, of course, there was no way they could have ever made a difference on that. It was what it was. And sad as it is, it changed the fire service forever because now we have not only the immediate response that we have just in our local communities and the things that we deal with, but now we're looking at it from a totally different lens, which is we've got a lot of bad people out there that want to take us out, firefighters included. And we were usually the ones that were on the good side, and people were always looking to us as we were the good guys. And now we were no different. And I think a lot of that mentality shift has caused a lot of the PTSI that we see within our own organizations today. So it really changed the way we do business.
Yeah, and I can only imagine that for some time after that incident, every station of firefighters was thinking, what's the closest city to us? Is that going to be a target? And if it is,
Right.
are we're going to be sent out there?
And I was stationed just outside of Disneyland, and
Yeah.
Disneyland was a target hazard. So we were very conscious conscious of knowing that Disney could be hit as well. You want to make a big impact. You want to really get people off their game, especially in the
Yeah.
tourist industry.
Oh
You
yeah.
go after big target hazards, and so we that kicked off several years of us pre-planning and training at levels that I had never seen in the fire service before, specifically with how we do business at Disneyland.
Wow. Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see the ripple effect. And same thing with the military bases we talked on the show. I had some guys on who, before 9/11 and all the Middle East conflicts there, what they would just drive on base. Then after that, there was threat con levels, there was gates, there was security, and just
Mm,
how, like you said, now we need to be always ready,
yeah,
be prepared in the training for the worst
yeah,
case scenario. And I know a
yeah.
lot of military members and servicemen on the law enforcement side, it can be tiring, especially for the younger ones when you're like, why are we doing all this training? This is never going to happen. Even the idea of preparing for a World War III can seem really far-fetched to a lot of people, but the reality of it is we could be minutes away from conflict at any time, especially with we're seeing more and more conflict and violence arise in the world right
Right,
now.
right, exactly. That's exactly right. Everything can change on a dime, and since 2001, when 9/11 hit, we have seen those threat levels at
Yeah.
all areas of our industry. We know they exist. We know that there's more than just international terrorism. There's domestic terrorists.
Yeah.
There's just a whole host of threat zones and threats from terrorist organizations and just people who want to do the United States harm. Let's
Yeah.
face it, we're in a global conflict right now, and America does not have the respect that it once did.
Yeah.
And we're
Unfortunately.
open. We're open. Our blind side is open. I think there's a lot of Americans that are are not quite engaged at the threat level that's necessary, understanding what we are up against, that this is
Mhm.
not just a couple of homegrown issues. This is not just politics as normal. This is something on a level that, I'm 62 years old. I've never seen this in my life.
Yeah. I know they recently stopped just like 2, 3 weeks ago a supposed terror attack plan for New York City, to think just recently. And like you said, I mean, there's people doing missile testing all the time, different countries. And most importantly, like you said, there's a lot of, even within the United States, there's conflict and enemies arising out of that, unfortunately. And now I know 9/11 is a very catastrophic event, like you mentioned, and the biggest one in firefighting history. But also during your career, those 24 years, what were some of the other big events? Were there any particular missions you went on that really changed how you saw things, or really were heart-wrenching, whether it was losing other firefighters or people who were victims of the fire, or just the way things went? I mean, what are some of those incidents, if you could talk about those?
Probably the biggest one that I responded to was Hurricane Katrina
Okay. Yeah.
in Louisiana. And we were assigned out there for 21 days.
Wow.
And, seeing the devastation of what that hurricane did, it completely opened my eyes to how how tragic life can turn on a dime. I mean, these folks were, minding their own business. They were doing their own thing. And before you knew it, they knew this threat was coming in, but due to some unforeseen leadership issues, a lot of people got trapped, and it was up to us to go in there and rescue them in the flooded zones and deal with the aftermath of what uh, happens when people are not prepared. We found people that were up in their attics. We found people on the roofs. It was the best way I could describe it. It was a large scale water rescue is what it was, because
Mm.
there was water everywhere. I mean, you couldn't walk without being in water. And we found some, pretty tragic situations that were pretty sad to, have to deal with. But, it's like you with anything, you know the mission and you accept it. And with that comes the consequences of the aftermath of that mission. So you're going to see things, and you're going to be involved with things that could come back to haunt you. And a lot of people, the PTSD side of our mental health, a lot of people suffered tremendously from that.
Yeah.
But then there's local stuff. I mean, just the local stuff. It's every day. You're running on people's worst days. That's what we do. We run on
Yeah.
people's worst day, their worst nightmare. And and as this story is going to unfold, I became one of those stories later on in my career, and I had to navigate through that. So, I guess the main thing that I'd like to say with that is it doesn't matter, for fire, for police, military. We put on the uniform, we pin the badge, and we do the job that's before us. And the aftermath, how we deal with the aftermath is something that each department has to determine what's best for them. And one of the things that we as firefighters probably do to the credit of most is that we have a tight knit community, and we talk. And it's, getting it out and voicing your emotions, your concerns, your what you could have done better. And we have these after action meetings, and we find out, okay, how can we do it better next time? So that's important. And I would always highly recommend that whatever the incident is, if it's traumatic enough, get with the leaders of your organization and talk it out. And if it's not, like on my crew, I had a small crew. We would just talk among ourselves. And a lot of times we would do our best to put a smile on each other's face
Yeah.
and laugh through it to the best of our ability.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people just hear the word PTSD and they assume and they associate that it has to be combat related. But there's a lot of different forms of PTSD that are non-combat related, and that's really
Yeah.
important for people to remember. Now,
Yeah.
it's funny you mentioned Hurricane Katrina, because I remember that, but I remember more importantly, I was born and raised in New Jersey, And I found out, this was a historic event for me because I lived there, but I found out when I was in service, some people had never heard of it. Hurricane Sandy had destroyed most of New Jersey. I mean, it just, I remember watching News 12 is the news channel there, and they had like 300, they did a year straight, day one, day two, day three of recovery, day four, all the way to 365 almost or plus. A lot of news channels did that, because people were months after this hurricane had hit. It was so devastating that months afterward, people were finding personal items or
Hmm.
finding their boat or their car that had just been taken completely somewhere else. I mean, I remember the boardwalk that I was raised on. The whole roller coaster was sitting in the ocean. All the rides, half of them were buried underwater. The whole boardwalk had been destroyed, and there was a lot of tragedy with that, especially,
Hmm.
at the Jersey Shore and down south. And I
Yeah.
remember for some reason the shore home we had on this little island was one of the only ones that just was untouched, and then there was other people, their whole house had just been taken somewhere else. I
Mm.
don't think people realize, especially people who are landlocked, which they have tornadoes, so but the devastation of natural disasters, of
Right.
those hurricanes and tornadoes, and I don't think people realize what a role firefighters play in all of that. And so
Yeah.
one thing I want to talk about is, did you lose anyone when you were serving during that time?
Well, I did lose my best friend from high school. He got hired by Anaheim before I did. And then 2 years after I got hired, he succumbed to leukemia, and it
Mm,
was considered job related. So yeah, I lost him, and lost a lot of people after retirement. Never anybody on the job while I was
okay.
there, but we have had people that have. I've got another friend that retired out early in his career because he got hit by a car while working a car fire on the road, and a car ran him over, and he ended up getting through the injury but could never be a fireman again, and he ended up trade getting a being retrained, got a different career, and then all the stuff started coming back, and he was going to end up losing his new job because of the brain injuries that he suffered and things like that, and he ended up committing suicide. So I do have a lot of friends that suffered with PTSD, maybe not as they didn't recognize it as such then.
Yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
but nonetheless, I don't think a lot of us understood what PTSD was in the 90s and the early 2000s. It wasn't until, probably within the last 10, 15 years that people really have started to hone in on the mental health side, first responders,
Yeah.
which was a huge key. And one of the things that, as the union president, when I was with Anaheim, we pushed very hard for a PTSD or a mental health coverage for our firefighters that were struggling.
Yeah. And I know from your bio, you also lost your oldest son, and it's a very unfortunate thing for any
Mm-hmm.
parent to lose their child. Was that during retirement or during your
No,
time
no,
serving?
it was during my time on the floor. Yeah, I lost my son was murdered. Do you want to go into that story right now, or do you want to?
I do. I know it's
Okay,
a tragic story, but I think
okay.
it's important for you to share and to talk about that.
Yeah, my son Mike in 2013, just 7 days before Christmas, we got a phone call. Well, it wasn't a phone call. We actually got a knock on the door at like
Mm,
4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock. I mean, it was early in the morning, and
yeah.
it was the sheriff's department asking if we were the parents of Michael Cheatham, and we knew exactly what was going on. We knew exactly what that phone call or that door knock was, and it completely changed our lives forever. That was in 2013. We spent the next year navigating through a very quick, fortunately, murder trial. The man was convicted. He was caught in my son's home, so there was really no way for him to escape. He ended up going to prison for the rest of his life, hopefully without any possibility of parole. However, we do have this thing in California now that they've got these second, third chance kind of programs where if you, I'm trying to remember the exact terminology, but I think you have to spend at least 75% of your time. You got to age out at 65. And once you've reached some of those markers, you're eligible for parole. Well, this guy that murdered our son is not eligible for parole. But now with these new compassionate laws, he could be eligible here probably within the next, 20 plus years, maybe
Mm.
even sooner. We don't know. But he's in jail. I'm fine with it. But the problem is that once you lose a child, your world changes forever. Everything that you thought was 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 right is now questionable. You just don't know anymore. Your trust goes down. You start to, you know, you start to look at people a little differently. I mean, I, when you come from a scenario where your son is tragically and brutally murdered, your I don't know,
I get what you're
your
saying. Your trust
compassion,
in
your
people.
compassion for
Mm.
society changes a little bit because you're always on the defense. You don't know who you can trust, who you can't trust. You don't know if this guy's on the up and up. I mean, my son, this guy knew my son. My son knew him. They were friends. They worked together even. And so it changes your perspective on a lot of things. And it causes you to not deal with things that you probably should deal with, like grief. For me, I didn't deal with my grief very well. I I I I just dove into work. I was the union president I was just nominated to the board at the time. And then after my first year became the president of the union that navigated through some of the most difficult times in our organizational history. And so I just put all my focus on that. So I really didn't pay much attention to my own mental condition of where I was. And what it caused was a lot of unresolved anger that I thought I had dealt with that was going to help navigate through it, but it basically just pushed everything down. And because it pushed it down and I didn't deal with it, I started noticing a very uneasy tension that I always had. I was on the edge half the time. I was like,
Yeah.
almost in a fight or flight kind of scenario. I was like, okay, are we going to be fighting here? Or am I going to be flying here? I mean,
Yeah.
where are we going with this? And I thought I did a good job of just getting to a place where in the words, I could say I forgive the guy for what he did. I mean,
Mm.
what must be going through your dang head when you're willing to take out a kid, you know, at 23 whose life's just getting started, all because
Yeah.
of your self-centeredness and where you were in life at the time. So I thought I was able to forgive, but unfortunately what I found out was I didn't really forgive the way that I needed to at the time.
Mm.
And so because I pushed everything down and because I kept pushing for, staying busy, I didn't have to deal with it. And then when I finally was able to retire in 2020 and moved to Nashville, my daughter, who was 13 at the time when her brother was murdered, um, she was now a young woman wanting to move out on her own. And so she chose Denver, Colorado. So I helped her move out to Denver, Colorado. And then I went back home and then we packed all our stuff. And then we ended up moving to Nashville, Tennessee. And then we were planning on making a trip back out to her apartment and help her get settled in the springtime. So we went back out and she had a next door neighbor that had recently moved in and was making unwanted advancements and was kind of a stalker type guy. And I started hearing this and I'm thinking, man, this is not going to be good. If I get out there and this guy starts making a play or he starts getting
Yeah.
froggy with me, I knew where my mental capacity was. I was still holding on to all that anger. And
For
so sure
sure.
enough, we get out there and this guy ends up having a conversation with my wife, just my wife. And that led into a discussion with my son because he overheard the conversation, which then led to me being called in. And before I knew it, I was flying up those stairs and I was ready for engagement. And I was going to, if this guy took one wrong move,
Yeah.
everything that I had building up in me for those 7+ years was going to come out. And sure enough, they did. And made some remarks at me. I made some remarks back at him, and
Right.
I challenged him. I said, "You know what? You're tough when it comes to threatening these young ladies, but let's see what you got when it comes to an old man. Let's see how well you can handle me." And I charged him. and he pulled a 9mm on me. And so it's the first time I've ever had a gun pulled on me. And it just caused me to back for a second. And I could see it in his eyes that he was not prepared to pull that trigger. So I tried to force him to pull it because at this point, you get,
Yeah,
I just, I was so angry. I was so protective of my daughter. I was so, trying to deal with all the non-resolved issues that I had with my son's death. And to me, this guy became the perfect target to take all that aggression out. And then when he pulled the gun on me, it caused me to have to take a reflection here. Long story short, he ended up getting arrested that day, lost his gun because he had that concealed carry, which was, he didn't have a permit for it. So he lost
mm,
that. We got my daughter moved out and got home, felt a little safer now that she was said and done and everything was tucked away for her and she was prepared. And then a month later, I fell and broke my neck at C4 and C5 and was left paralyzed from the chest down. And that's where the story kind of gets real interesting because that's where my mental health really took a turn for the worst.
for sure.
So not just burying my son at my early 50s, but then dealing with the confrontation at my daughter's apartment. Then a month later, I'm laid up 2.5 months in the hospital learning how to walk again. The injury was so severe at the time, they didn't know if I was going to ever walk again. They didn't know if I'd ever have the use of my hands again. They didn't know, what my outlook would be. But they said, if you keep positive and you work and you make the effort, we think we can get you to a place where, you could have an independent lifestyle at least. And so that's what we shot to do. We made that our priority. When they came to me in the hospital, they asked me what my goal was. And I said I had one goal, and that goal is to walk out of this hospital. And 2.5 months
Yeah,
later, I was able to walk out of the hospital and start this new recovery that's now a little over 3.5 years. And the first year was probably the hardest, followed by the second, which started to give me some hope. And now in the third, I've completely gone to the other side of it, and I now use everything that happened to me as a way of inspiring and transforming the lives of anybody that deals with traumatic injuries or traumatic loss or just the mental mind games that come along with trauma in your life.
yeah, I know a lot of the stats show that firefighters, police officers, military, that after they retire, if they did the full 20 years or however long, the longer, the more likely this is that they'll die within a year or two or three or become addicts if they don't find a hobby or another
Mm,
career or a job to keep them occupied. A lot of
yeah,
them fall victim to that. In
yeah,
your case, I won't say it was a blessing, but you were forced to be occupied with your recovery. And I just
right.
curious how that played a role in all of it, because obviously you had retirement plans, sort of. I know it was a year earlier than expected, but how did you deal with that? How did you deal with here comes retirement, you're finally gonna relax, and then boom, that's all taken
Right.
away from you. And I mean, in a way now, you're living a retired life that is completely different than what you had planned beforehand as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was very fortunate while I was actually in the hospital in rehab learning to walk. My wife, who is also a nurse, was an ICU nurse for many years. Um, she understood the process of creating an environment that is conducive to healing, and in my case,
Mm,
not just physical healing, but mental healing as well,
okay.
coming from a very active background that I had. So she helped me with just creating the environment within the room with essential oils, with music, with everything was just taken care of. I didn't have to worry about anything. All this while she was working. She spent the night with me. Her work gave her the time off. So she literally spent the night with me almost every night I was in the hospital on a bedside right next to me. I had friends from the fire service who were flying from Southern California from my department in Anaheim out to Nashville. So I had people with me every
Wow.
single day I was there, which does a lot to build your mindset to be able to overcome because now you've got a reason. I've got my wife, I've got all my friends and that are coming out. I've got my family out here. I've got my kids that were coming out to see me. They were like I said, my daughter was in Denver, and my son was still living in California, and I had them coming out. That was all great. And then I finally was released. I finally walked out of that hospital. It was a big deal. And then everybody went home, everything went back to normal. And now I'm learning how to deal with all of my post injury deficits, not having the use of my hands, not being able to be I was a contractor before I was a fireman. So I was a builder. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't
Right.
do any stuff around the house anymore. Trying to, just do the little chores that I need to do as a homeowner was very, very difficult. And I'd have to hire it out. So I was getting frustrated. I was getting depressed. And
Right.
before I knew it, and here's the crux of this entire conversation, before I knew it, my mindset had shifted from one of I can overcome anything to one of I am now a victim of my circumstance. I will never be the same again. My body will never be normal again. I will never have the function of my hands again. And it's all this negative mind shifting that was taking
Yeah.
place. And it was taking me to a dark place. It was taking me to a dark place in my life that I was ready to quit. I didn't want to. Why live anymore? Why bother with the process of trying to spin out of this thing? I mean, sure, if I ask this question to your audience, I mean, have you ever got to a place in your life when things happened that were so traumatic that you just said, "Why me? Why is this happening? This is not fair." And
Yeah.
I cycled into what I call my victim mentality, my victim cycle. So when I was in my victim cycle, I didn't want to work anymore. I didn't want to try anymore. I didn't want to try to, better myself. I just wanted to feel sorry for myself, and everybody else was doing a good job of feeling sorry for me too. So, I just jumped on that bandwagon, and my wife got to a place. She said, "Look, we've been through way too much in our marriage for you to give up.
Yeah.
And if this is what it's going to be," she says, "I can't do it. I can't do
Mm.
it. I know you're not what you used to be physically, but your mind's still there, and you can still in, empower people the way you did as a captain on the floor, the way you did as a union president, the way you did as a contractor, the way you've empowered people your whole life. You've given people hope. You've given people the will to overcome addiction. You've done all this in your life, Rick. The information's still there. So I need you to be the man that you were called to be." And that started me on a journey. And she woke me up, and it started me on this journey of learning how to overcome my mindset. And I ended up enrolling in a group, and through that group I listened to a man at a keynote address he gave to our group. And one of the things he walked us through was he asked, "What is it that you think about yourself the most? What kind of feelings or what kind of thoughts do you have that are repetitive, that keep identifying with or keep solidifying who you think you are?" And as I got through the end of that process, I had one word that kept coming to my mind, and that word was useless. I felt useless. And he asked if there was any volunteers that would like to share what that feeling was. And my hand went up without even realizing that this guy could call on me. And now I got to go up in front of
Yeah.
everybody and explain it. And sure enough, that guy called me. I was in the back row, called me up, and I started talking to him, and he asked me about it. And I said, "Well, I feel useless, and here's why." I gave him my reasons. And he asked me, "Do you think I'm useless?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "Well, I was just wondering because you put a lot of emphasis on your body mechanics as being useful." So now let me tell you the backstory about the man I was standing in front of. His name is Nick Santanastasso. Nick was born with no legs and one arm. And he is probably one of the most inspirational, transformational speakers you'll ever hear on the circuit. The guy is phenomenal. And he walked me through the process of transforming my thought process, transforming what I'd identified as useless into the most identifying term that I could give it at the time, which for him was
Right.
useful. So if you're not useless, you could be useful. And here I am with no legs and one arm, and my body don't work the way that everybody else's does, and I'm useful. So he changed my paradigm. He changed my mind shift, and I started working with Nick after that. And now, having been with him for some time, I have now shifted gears yet again and been able to take my story, my victim mentality, and shift gears into opening the doors for many, many others who are challenged by, whether it's your work, whether it's your relationships, whether it's your own health, whether it's your family, your marriage. It doesn't matter. We all struggle with trials and tribulations. We all struggle with challenges. Life is a challenging arena. And the reason it's challenging is because it's helping us shift gears out of being victimized by circumstances into being victorious over circumstances. And that mind shift requires us to look and become aware of the things we don't always notice within our own psyche, which is number one, what is it do I think about most often? What are my thoughts? Are my thoughts centered around fears? Are my thoughts centered around past experiences that keep me from moving forward in my future? Are my thoughts predicated on how terrible, wrong, bad, and awful I am? I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to be successful. I don't deserve to have a good relationship. I'm too short. I'm too tall. I'm too whatever. I mean, just listen to the
Right.
communication that goes on in your own thoughts every single day. So you become aware of those. And once you become aware of your own thought patterns and your belief systems, you can start to make some intentional changes. And in those intentional changes, you can start to focus on some areas that will help you cycle out of that thought process. And once you become aware, you set some intentions. Okay, what is it that I do want? What do I want to accomplish? What do I feel like is my purpose? And once we start to get people to that place, the next big moment is then we shift our mind. We shift our mind from a victim mentality to one of being a victorious mentality. I can overcome anything. And not only can I overcome them, but I can learn to thrive in them. And I call that my AIM method, AIM. So awareness, intention, followed up with a mindset shift. And you can literally aim at any circumstance and have success pivoting out of it because now you've got the tools. And what I had to come to in my mind shift gearing is I had to come to recognize that I had a lot of hostility, a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, and a lot of bitterness that was rooted deep within my heart over what this man did to my son and what he did to my family. And because I had all of that unresolved anger and that conflict was going on in my battle, my mind was constantly thinking on, well, if this guy did it to this son, what if he does it to my other son? What if somebody else
Yeah.
does something to my other son? What if I lose another child? And I started just dwell on all the what ifs of life that were negative, and it just drained and depleted me. And so here's what I had to do. I had to come to a recognition that my mind thoughts, the thoughts that I had repeatedly been thinking over and over and over, were so negative that the energy level was at a negative level. And when my energy level was at a negative level, then all the output, the directions that I wanted to go were all in a negative sense. So everything that I thought was negative. So therefore, I kept creating negative patterns. I kept creating negative outcomes. And once I was able to finally acknowledge that and see that, I was able to relieve that through finally forgiving the man that murdered my son. And once I was able to finally forgive him, I was able to get back into a position of power. And the position of power is nothing more than being a victorious or being having victory over the circumstance and then being able to navigate to a different direction with intention. And having been able to do that gave me a new sense of purpose. Okay, now that you're retired, you're not going to be using your hands. So you're not going to really be able to build things like you once thought you would be. I was going to get into like house flipping and doing things like that, building things
Yeah.
and then selling them after they've been fixed up. Well, since that wasn't going to be an necessarily the way of going, the next best thing was through Nick's help. he he certified me in transformational speaking. So I went through his courses and developed a entirely different way of approaching life through the lens of helping other people who have to suffer through their own challenges and their own dilemmas and their own traumas through the art of mind shifting. And so now that's what I do. I take on clients on a one-on-one coaching endeavor, and then I also do public speaking for transformational speaking for events for people that are trying to gear up their constituency and their people to overcome and become all that they can be in life and become successful regardless of what cards life throws at you. So that's been my life for the last 2 years now, is shifting that gear. And now that I'm on the other side, man, I tell you what, it's absolutely amazing that a guy that suffered the loss of his son, broke his neck at C4 and C5. I mean, those are probably two of the most traumatic things that could ever happen to a person in their lives. Every parent fears the loss of their child. And when I grew up, all my activities, all I can remember was my mom saying, "Don't do that. You'll break your neck." So here I am, lost a kid, broken neck, and I've been able to climb out of that pit at such a level now that it gives hope and inspiration to all those I come in contact with, because the energy that you can maintain for yourself and for others when you overcome those types of trials. And these aren't things that people, well, I probably can't. That's great for you, Rick. I know you could. No, I'm telling you, when you can come to the place where you don't even want to live anymore, to a place of not only do I want to live, but I want to change the legacy of not only my life and my lineage, but I want to help change the legacy and the lineage of every person I come in contact with, because now I have the tools. I know what it takes to get on course and make a difference, not only in your life and for your family, but also in the lives of everybody you come in contact with. Because let's face it, we've got a lot of mind shifting that needs to take place in this world today. Just look at the world
Yeah.
around us right now. It's based on fear, and fear
Mhm.
is the enemy to success. If you let it, if you let it attack you and immobilize you. But the other thing that fear does, it is the great liberator, because not only if you will be liberated from your fear if you take the intentional action to move toward the fear. In other words, let fear be your guide. If you're fearful of a conversation, if you're fearful of the relationship, if you're fearful of your career choices, if you're fearful of promotion that's being offered, if there's fear associated with something in your life, and I'm not talking about the fear of, keeping your head on a swivel in a dark alley. I'm not talking about that type of fear. I'm talking about the fear that we generate in our minds every day through the things that we think. Once you can overcome that fear becomes your roadmap, and you follow that fear so that you can prove to yourself that the fear was never tangible. It was all a figment of my imagination. And once you've overcome and you've pushed through that fear, you realize that when you get to the other side, you look back and go, what was I afraid of? I don't get why I was so fearful that I just stagnated and I wouldn't move. I just stopped. I wanted to give up. That's what the power of being victorious over circumstances, as opposed to being a victim of your circumstances, will create in each one of us. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you've come from. And it doesn't matter what the circumstances that life has thrown at you. You have the ability, because you are in control of your life. And too many times we've been sold the bill of goods that our circumstances control us. And when we get there in life, that means we're like a ship out on the ocean with no rudder and no motor. It's just, we're just tossed to and fro, and anywhere we
Right.
go that's it. And it's usually not going to be a very good ending. But when you can navigate even the toughest waters of life with success, uh, you're going to find that on the other side, your life is going to find purpose again. But then here comes the challenge. Nobody does that by themselves. You can't do it by yourself. You have to be involved with people who have gone on and done it before you. If you try to navigate life with the same people and the same circumstances that got you there to begin with, you're never going to find your way out of it. And so what I had to do is I had to find a coach like Nick. I have another coach named Ryan. These guys are my coaches, they're my mentors, and they help me when navigation is difficult. They help me see through it all. They see through the fog because they've already been there. And so that's my role now. That's my purpose. My purpose in life now is to find the people that are seeking to become victorious over their circumstances and their challenges, and then hire me as a coach, and I will help navigate you with guarantee that you will get on the other side of this because I did it with myself. And I've got people that have done it with me. So it's not a sense of, well, I hope I can do it. I mean, I might be able to do it. No, it's a guarantee you can do it, because when you are training at the level, whether you're in the military, whether you're in the fire service, whether you're, first responder, doesn't matter. Regardless of where you are, it takes training. And the best trainer, or the best training to get, is someone who's already been through it, and they can train with you and they can coach you through the steps. And so that's what we do
Yeah.
now. We help people through the steps of challenging times in their life.
That's beautiful. And ladies and gentlemen, in the description below, you will find the links to Mr. Cheatham, so you can either hire him as a speaker at an event or work with him one-on-one and see other shows he's been in and all that. But Mr. Cheatham, thank you so much for coming on the show and
I
sharing
appreciate
your
it.
story and everything, all your advice. That was great. And I really appreciate you opening up about those tragic moments that can be very difficult to talk about even after healing. So I thank you for that.
Right. I appreciate that. I appreciate you for having me on your show. It's an honor. It really is.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide, through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side, as one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.